This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Care Notes with Doug Wilber. And Doug, I think you have an interesting subject to talk about that we want to call breathless courage today. So explain to me what breathless courage is all about.
Sure. I think what I want to do is I want to tell a little bit of a story, and hopefully that'll help you understand what breathless courage is really about. It was 2:07 in the morning, and the alarm went off. It was a high-pitched, unrelenting tone that made Karen's heart stop. She knew that sound. It terrified her. It meant her husband's ventilator had failed. She ran quickly into the room. Her eyes were adjusting to the dark. He couldn't speak, but his eyes were telling everything. And she didn't panic. She didn't even call 911. She just reached over, reset the valve, and whispered, "You're okay. I'm here." That's courage. That's caregiving. And I think that reflects what so often our caregivers see every day. That's really an amalgamation of different stories. But with Care Notes, one of my goals is to talk about the unsung heroes behind America's care. Each episode we try to talk about subjects. We try to tell real stories of people who care for others. So often the care that people are doing is quiet, it's unseen, but it's always a reflection of an extraordinary heart. Sometimes that's professionally done, sometimes it's personally done. But today's story that I had brought up was breathless courage. And it's really reflecting caring with someone who has a disease called ALS. That's a disease that takes away movement, speech, and even breath itself. More than that, it's really about what remains, and what remains for that individual is love, loyalty, the courage to show up every day, even when your own body is trembling with exhaustion. And that is what so often what happens with the caregivers that are taking care of their spouse, their loved one that has ALS. I guess one of the things I'd like to know is, have you ever wondered what it feels like to know that someone's life literally depends on you being alert every night, all night?
You know, when I was a young mother, especially the first time, that's exactly how I felt. My oldest son, when he was born, they mistaken the soft spot on his head being enlarged as that he had an illness. They thought he had encephalitis or something. And so the first week of his life, he spent in the NICU. And they couldn't come up with anything. He wasn't ill. But they told him when they sent him home, you must be very, very careful with this infant because we don't know. And I kept saying, he was a forceps birth. Go back and look at his soft spot. But of course they didn't. I was the stupid mother. And for weeks, I made sure that child of mine slept right next to me.
Yeah.
And, his breath would change and I would jump up.
Right.
So I know what that feels like. But once I knew that he was really okay, I sort of let my guard down.
Yeah.
Okay, now you can go back to your bedroom. but I can't imagine what it's like to have your loved one who has ALS, who today is somewhat functional and slowly loses those functions, and you're responsible. That's got to be terrifying.
Yeah, and like your story, so often when someone is diagnosed with ALS or any type of disease, we have to learn fast. We have to learn things that we never even thought that we would have to learn. It's like life is thrust upon you, and you can respond in different ways, but so many people rise up to the occasion, and they become um, experts in a very short period of time, doing things that they never ever thought that they would do. But it's something that most of us don't think about until we're actually there.
Right.
In this case, um, and thousands and thousands of people across the country live this reality every single day. And in this situation with this scenario, it is a reality. It is something that people are consistently experiencing, and it weighs heavy. I mean, the people who are taking care of other people, whether it's ALS or other things, are exhausted. In this scenario, Kara's husband, Tom, was diagnosed with ALS 3 years ago. And before that, he was a carpenter. He built homes with his own hands. He built their home with his own hand. The same hands that taught their kids to tie the shoes and hammer nails and build tree houses. Now those hands can't even lift a fork. They Oftentimes he has to be fed. And and yet every night she tucks him into bed in the house that they built together, and gives him the quiet dignity of being able to have care where he wants to be in his own home. Um, Unfortunately, ALS is relentless. It steals every movement, and then it takes away someone's speech, and then it takes away their breath, and the one thing it doesn't take away, I've seen over and over, it doesn't take away the love between people. And so um, it, the thing about in this story is Karen had learned to manage the ventilator in every setting, every alarm. She taped a checklist above the headboard, power, tubing, mass fit, oxygen flow. It was generally routine. It was something that she did over and over and over until that night, and something went wrong. And, it had been the power flickered, then the silence, then the alarm, and then that piercing, shrill sound that felt unstoppable that happened. And
Yep.
she ran. We all know that feeling. Your mind's blank, your heart's pounding. It's like, what do I do? Am I up to this? And unhook the tubing, check the battery, nothing. Then she remembered the backup valve, that little silver lever that she practiced a dozen times, and it worked. The machine hummed back to life, and um, her husband's chest rose, and he was breathing again, and she was able to finally breathe herself.
Sure.
It was something that had been literally seconds had felt like hours, and any of us who've been through a crisis knows that feeling. And you know afterwards, she didn't cry, she didn't fall apart. she just sat next to him. She counted each breath and whispered, "You're okay." And then that night, Karen taped a new note on the ventilator, and it said, "Check battery." It said, "Check tubing," and it said, "Breathe." Um, and, later, I'm sure she thought it's not a checklist anymore. It's a prayer. Um, and, you know, it, that story, like I said, is a combination of different stories and things that I've seen, but it's something that I think should give us chills because it's a simple act that carries with it love, vigilance, devotion, the thing that caregivers do every single day for the people that they love. And I think there's an especially big burden in something like ALS or some of the neurological disorders where someone literally is dependent on you,
Right.
For their breathing, for their life. And what a heavy responsibility that is. It's the thing about caregiving is it's made of small acts that look ordinary, but they mean absolutely everything. Those those quiet nights that are filled with moments that define entire lives, and really define in many ways the meaning of love itself. Because what would make, there's a whole thing of meaning and humanity that goes into caregiving. That's why I believe caregiving is such an incredible calling, because you are literally laying down your life for others. It is biblical, and powerful what people do every day. They are living out, in my view, the scriptures, and most of us don't really think about it. And in matter of fact, most of the people who are doing it don't even see that that's what they're doing. But there is, there's a scripture that says, "Greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for another." And I think, that's reflected in many different things in many
Sure.
different ways, but it is the core of being human, in my view, or being a good human, I guess. So
Sadly, when so many of us think of caregivers, um, we think of them as almost adult babysitters, and I hate to say that, but
oh yeah,
I've heard that word over and over again. Um, and I know that the people who cared for my mother, they did it out of love and respect for the profession. And they called it their profession. It wasn't
yeah,
just a job. And caregivers don't get paid typically real well. And
no,
yet we're asking them to take care of our loved one, make sure our loved one is breathing, make sure our loved one is eating, make sure our loved one, you know, um, is changed and bathed and clothed properly. And yet at the same time, we we as a society are not giving caregivers the true respect that they need. I've been following a family on Facebook, and their mother has dementia, and she's probably in her final stages. Um,
mm,
and her three daughters rotate taking care of her between going to work and whatever. But her husband has remained her constant love. And it's so beautiful because he walks in the house and she beams. As soon as she sees him, she recognizes there's something special about him. And
yeah,
he truly, you can see the true love and how he interacts with her. And her daughters I mean, they're giving up a lot of their life because they're working full time, but they've taken different shifts of work so they can be there for mom. And that's family caregiver. But we see caregivers in businesses like yours that are devoted to their clients.
Oh yeah.
They're not just a patient, you know, they are somebody who really has a story and a life. And I don't know how we can change that narrative, but I think it's important. And I'm glad that we do this because none of us know when we're going to need that caregiver.
Yeah.
I want the caregiver who is really there for me.
Yeah, it's interesting because going back to what you were saying about the professional caregiver, the professional caregiver uh, uh, will oftentimes suffer extreme grief after someone that they've cared for has passed away. I was talking to someone today, and they said to me, they said, the family was not around. They're all out of state. And she said, I was this person's um, closest individual as far as relationally.
Right.
Now, I'm sure that the person she was talking about, felt an affinity or a closeness to the family that was unlike what he was feeling for the caregiver, but there was a bond and a closeness because she was his daily
Yeah.
person, and grew a fondness and a love, for this individual, and because of that, when he was gone, suffered tremendous grief, um, because it wasn't just a transaction. It was a relationship, and any good caregiver is going to develop a relationship that is close and dear, and there's a fondness typically that grows between them, with professional boundaries, and we encourage or want the professional boundaries, but it is there. And so whether it is, for short term or for long term, a good caregiver is opening their hearts, knowing that at some point in time their hearts are going to be broken,
Right.
and that's a really amazing thing, honestly. That's probably one of the things that amazes me as much about caregivers as anything, is for those really good caregivers, the ones that truly open their hearts, how they can do that. Because it wasn't, they're actually choosing this. It's not thrust upon them like it's a family member,
Right.
and you have that. It's like, I'm choosing to allow my heart to someday be broken, and that's a place that a lot of times people won't go to. One of the things I do want to explore a little bit is, ALS. Um, uh, if someone's not familiar with ALS, it's amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is a neurological disease that destroys the nerve cells controlling voluntary muscles. And uh, people, as I mentioned before, lose the ability to move, speak, eat, and eventually to breathe on their own. And it's one of those weird things. You can say that it's cruel, or I don't think it's a cruelty in this particular case, but I think it is something that complicates things, and that is that people's minds stay sharp. That doesn't get destroyed with ALS. They're fully aware of everything that's happening, even as their bodies stop obeying them
Yeah.
in what you're trying to. It's our minds. We tell our, without thinking about, we're telling our hand to move,
Yep.
and and then it moves, and now your brain says move and it doesn't, and there's lots of frustration and other things that go on with that. But the thing about um, this particular disease is that you're not only supporting, and this is true with most things in caregiving, but you're not just supporting the body, but you're also supporting that present mind, that
Right.
someone who's understanding things, and that person still wants to communicate, or still wants to be living life, and yet they have a body that's saying,
No.
or in rebellion to what's going on. um, and that care then means, because of all the complications with it, is that you have to manage ventilators, you have to do feeding tubes, you have to position, you have to suction, and this is not happening in a hospital. It's happening in most cases in someone's home, and it's totally complex. It's very technical, and it's unrelenting. And normally you see there's a wife or a, a child or someone that is doing this, um, and this is something that is typically not just a professional caregiver involved in it because of the complexity. It's usually a family member, and these folks are you know um, people like Karen in my example are now respiratory therapists, and they're
Yep.
engineers, and they're nurses, and it's all mixed up in the same package, and that comes from, in most cases, someone who probably had trouble putting a band-aid on, you know, 6 months earlier, and
Sure.
all of a sudden they are baptized in this new reality, and through it all, they're still the wives, the husbands, the daughters, the sons that they were before, and so you have this real complex emotional uh, uh, picture as well, because you're both, you're or you're all of those things, um and the reality is you're still human. And so you're still trying to hold on to love and dignity in a situation that is basically testing that. You're struggling in the reality of this whole thing, and that's why I think something like ALS is such an incredible um, uh, uh, when someone's faced with that. I just want to make sure that we sing the praises of these individuals, and again, it's an example of many other diseases, but it happens to be one of the more profound because of, first of all, it oftentimes happens very rapidly. Some cases not, but most of the times it happens rapidly, and it is very profound when it does happen.
Well,
So,
another thing I think we have to remember is both the patient with ALS and the family members. We know typically what the outcome is. Okay. They are progressing towards death. And as much as you want to make every day as good for them, in your mind, you still are grieving.
oh
And,
yeah,
you know, I know that um, it's really important for us to be able to help out those caregivers. It may not mean that we know what all the functions are with the breathing tubes and everything, but it means being there for support, even if it's just sitting with the person with ALS and letting them connect through looking at you or making a meal for the family because they need that support desperately. Like you said, this isn't something we plan for. And when it happens, especially if it happens quickly, you know, everybody has to learn a new way of life.
Yeah. And I would say, if I were going to kind of say, okay, let's put the care notes into some bullet points, you know, I would say the first bullet point is exactly that: support the client, the person that has ALS in whatever way we can, do our piece. If you're somehow involved with that individual or that family, understand that they're all there. Their
Yep.
mind is intact, and so they need friends, they need love, they need care, they need patience because it's hard to communicate and other things. And the second thing would be there for the primary caregiver. Sometimes all it requires is they need to get away for an hour so they can do something.
Right.
And if you can volunteer and say, I can do this, of course, there are professional services like ours that can and should be involved oftentimes as add-on support in those cases. The individuals themselves should not try to be heroes who are doing the caregiver,
Right.
And take it all on themselves because they can't. This is, really does take support. And that's why having professional services like ours is such a vital thing, because obviously, uh, um, families or other people can't always be involved in things, and that person does need that support to do things that they need done. And it's even possible that you could gift someone some care, and say, here's you know uh, here's 4 hours of care, something
Right.
like that. And figure out what that would cost, whether for a service, so that they can have some respite from what they're doing. Um, for those primary caregivers, they need to know the equipment like it's their own family.
Right.
You have to learn the machines, the ventilator, the tubing, the alarms, the practice restarts, repractice restarts, do it when it's calm, not in a crisis. Keep step-by-step guides near the bed and label everything, because in a panic, you don't want to be kind of looking, what do I do?
Right.
And like anything, like how they practice, flying into space or airplanes or whatever, it's all should be feel routine, step by step by step. Um, and there's a great book I read a few years ago. It's called The Checklist Manifesto, and it's a phenomenal book. If anyone ever wants a book, it talks about how you prevent mistakes by not only practicing things, but also by having a checklist. Did I do this? Did I do this? Whatever. And you do it in such a way that it becomes routine. And you prevent so many issues when you do that. People should prepare for power outages, make sure there's backup battery or a generator, or that the power companies knows that someone's in your home depends on life savings equipment, and that one call, can save hours of danger. Uh, Having a nightly routine or a nightly rhythm before bed, double check every connection, log your checks in a small notebook. So the checklist, to have checklists, whatever it is, somehow this happens so that you not only ensure safety, but it also will give that person the peace of mind to be able, hopefully, to sleep more soundly.
Sure.
Because, anything like that, it was like you were talking about, you heard every sound with your
Yep.
son.
Yep.
And that it's nice that if you kind of have that set, you've done everything you can, that it's that you've taken all the steps, you've done all those things. And then and another thing that I would say is take your own breath.
Yep.
Caregivers more often than not forget to breathe themselves. And it's important that every day you take that time, you close your eyes, you take one breath, and slow breathe for every breath that you protected through the night. You need the time for yourself to be able to have that space to do what you need to do to kind of collect, your get yourself together. I started doing this thing a number of years ago where before I would start work in the morning, I would just kind of have quiet time, and where I'd have my coffee. Oftentimes, I actually started by just sitting in my car. I would go to Dunkin' Donuts and I would sit in a parking lot and just drink the coffee before I actually went into to work. Um, and it was my kind of time to to kind of think before I started, to
Sure.
plan before I got into the heat of things. And whatever that is, I think people need to do that. And obviously, if there has been a close call, or if there's been things that have gone on, write down what's happened, what worked, what didn't, self-correct, figure out, oh, I was a little panicky here, if that's what you need to do, and get better. That re record of things can improve, and can help you, or can help others if you're coaching them on what to do or how to do it,
Sure.
and things that you found that were important, in sort of self-correcting. Um, the truth is in anything with caregiving, we're not going to be perfect. You're not going to do everything right every time. It's a learning process. And you thought through everything, but sometimes you haven't thought through everything. And you learn as you go along. And that's for any situation, any caregiving, and all the more with more significant things like this. So these things that I just mentioned are obviously practical, but they're also, hopefully a bit of a lifeline. A small system, a checklist, can be the difference between chaos and calm when
Yep.
you're in a situation. And that's why I share them. You turn lived experiences into wisdom, and hopefully that'll help all of us breathe a little easier. And
Absolutely. Well, you brought something up earlier, and I want to reiterate it because we've never said it in this manner, but the holidays are coming up, and we could gift our friends caregiving. And I never thought of that concept, but what an important gift that would be for someone, whether they're struggling or not. If this is something that you can offer, you don't know what else to give them, how else to support
right,
them. And so that can bring down the cost of caregiving for the family, but also give them that reassurance that here's another 4 hours or whatever of care that my significant other can have. And I can then take some time for me to refresh me and stay healthy. And I know that's the toughest part for many of us, that, and I know it was for my mother when my mother had caregiving in for my dad. She never wanted to leave. And
Right.
they kept telling her, you know, you have 4 hours, go to Starbucks, go grocery shopping, whatever. And she would say, no, I want to stay here. And then they'd say, if you're going to stay here, then why don't you go lie down in bed and take a nap? She didn't want to do that. And we finally had to convince her how important it was, because at the end of that shift, she was back in charge. And if she didn't get what she needed to be restored, she wasn't going to be able to support my dad. And
Right.
it took weeks for her to finally get there and realize, I can trust these people and this is what I should do. So I want us all to think about it. And, I think the tips you give every time on this podcast, it ignites something that all of us need to think about, because you never know if we're going to need the care or if we're going to be the caregiver. So,
Right. And, it's funny because if you were to talk to Karen, I'm sure, like so many people, she would say, I'm not brave. I just did what anyone would do. And if you've ever talked to someone who's fought in war, they never see themselves as a hero.
right,
The heroes were the ones that died,
right,
is how so many of them will classify it. And that's true with um, uh, and that's kind of what makes caregiving such a powerful thing, because there's a humbleness to caregiving that so often is there, because they're looking beyond themselves and looking at the individual and knowing that that person's the one that's suffering. I'm not the hero.
right,
So often they'll think that's the hero, the
right,
one that I'm caring for. And So, caregiving doesn't look like those grand gestures. It looks like quiet, steadfast love, humble love more often than not. And, so every night, there are thousands of homes with people like Karen that are holding a hand or checking a machine or whispering, "You're okay." And they don't think of it as courage, but it is courage.
absolutely,
And that's where, if we can be those that come alongside and support, and as you mentioned before, and I'm not trying to get people to give things, but the gifting someone, as you mentioned, is one of those things I've seen so often where that person would never pay for it for themselves, but a brother has come in and said, "Look, I'm going to give you so many hours a week in care because you need it."
yep,
And we'll step in, or 1,000 examples of things where there's a recognition of that caregivers need for those things. But I do think that that ALS and caregiving specifically for ALS teaches us something really profound, and that's that the human spirit can remain strong even as the body fades, and that's for the person receiving the care, and that love, when it's lived out through care, becomes kind of a quiet, breathless courage that's all its own. And there's this wonderful, amazing dance that happens between the caregiver and the care recipient, that I think shows the best of who we are, as humans. And it's that laying down ourselves for another that is lived out over and over and over again. And I've had the privilege of witnessing that. And One thing I do think, and I'll just mention a couple of things, is if someone does have ALS, hopefully they're involved in the ALS Association, and because I think they need to have support and support groups and help from other caregivers and
Sure.
the understanding of people who are going through the same thing as and that face those long nights or have to have that courage to face things that they never thought they would have to face. And that type of support, I think, is critically important. So just know that there are groups out there that can help, with that thing that people are going through. And most disordered diseases will have their own support groups, whether it be Alzheimer's Association that help with Alzheimer's and dementia conditions, or ALS or MS Society. So often those particular disorders have their unique things, and so being involved in that can make a big difference.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd probably like to end with that. So
All right. Well, thank you very much again for another enlightening conversation, and we'll do this at the end of the month again.
all
Thank you.
right, sounds good.
Great day.
Thanks.
Bye bye
Bye
now.
bye.